Liberty's Kids was a kids show on PBS Kids that ran from 2002 to 2003. It had 2 seasons and 40 episodes. Liberty's Kids follows the adventures of 3 kids as they record the historical events happening around them. They live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with Benjamin Franklin and a former slave, Moses, who bought his freedom and worked for Dr. Franklin. The 3 kids are Sarah Phillips, a British girl, James Hiller, an American boy, and Henri Lefebvre, a French boy. Henri and James meet Sarah on December 16, 1773, get caught up in the Boston Tea Party, and that is where the show begins. Throughout the video, I will be covering episodes 1 through 14, which span from the time of the Boston Tea Party until the first 4th of July, when the colonies declare independence. In the first episode of Liberty's Kids, Sarah is heading to the colonies on the ship the Dartmouth in Boston, Massachusetts. Upon further investigation, the boat that the Boston Tea Party occurred on was, indeed, the Dartmouth. Then we have Benjamin Franklin and his role in the Boston Tea Party. When Franklin did not participate in the Boston Tea Party directly, his letters were what inspired the colonists to do the Tea Party, just like he is accused of doing in the show by Alexander Wedderburn during Franklin's time in London, which is also when, as the show accurately points out, Franklin loses his title of Postmaster General. The next important milestone in the show is the introduction of the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Sarah, a girl from Britain, calls these acts the Coercive Acts, while James, a colonist, calls them the Intolerable Acts, just like the colonists and the British did historically. These acts, as they are presented in the show, are Boston Harbor getting shut down and the Quartering Act, where British soldiers are allowed to force colonists to let them stay in their house for as long as they wanted. This then takes us to the next major part of the show, the House of Burgesses. The show tells us that the Speaker of the House was going to be Patrick Henry before the Earl of Dunmore shut it down. So Patrick Henry instead speaks at St. John's Church and gives his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. This is all true to history, even down to the rousing speech inspiring the people listening to help Virginia to make an army to fight against Britain. Next up is the Midnight Ride. Something that the show mentions that most people do not know is that Paul Revere was not the only rider that night. Another man named William Dawes is also a writer, and the two were sent by Dr. Joseph Warren on April 18, 1775, to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that the British were heading to Lexington and Concord. On the note of Lexington and Concord, we arrive at the shot heard round the world. The shot heard round the world happened in Lexington when the British and the colonists were at a standoff until someone shot their musket, causing the two groups to fight. True to history, nobody truly knows which side fired the shot, but in that battle on April 19, 1775, 8 colonists were killed and many of them were wounded. This shot signifies the true beginning of the Revolutionary War in terms of the actual battles fought. The next event is the Second Continental Congress, where, true to history, reporters and journalists are not allowed into the meeting. However, this Congress decides that George Washington will be the one to lead the Continental Army against the British. This leads into the battle at Bunker Hill. Something that the show mentions that I did not expect was the fact that this battle was actually fought on Breed's Hill, only a little ways away from Bunker Hill. This battle is the first mention of the Continental Army being short on supplies. The next few events that happen are the first sign of the colonies using invisible ink to share secret information. A new colonial postal system was invented by Benjamin Franklin to keep the British from looking through their mail, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published to the colonies, inspiring some colonists to fight for freedom and angering others. The next few episodes focus on the Continental Army and what is going on there. True to history, supplies and rations were low in the Continental Army, and the soldiers were getting antsy. But after a win against the British in December of 1775, the British finally leave Boston. The next thing the show presents is the Turtle, the first submarine to be invented. At first, I was skeptical, but then I looked it up, and yes, this submarine was used to try to bomb the British ship, the HMS Eagle, and was created by David Bushnell in 1776. Even though the Turtle was unsuccessful, this fact surprised me and made me second-guess some presumptions I had about when things were invented in history. Finally, we've reached the first 4th of July. In this episode, Henry Lee presents a resolution to Congress that all the colonies are free and independent states, the colonies can seek foreign alliances, and the colonies can establish a plan of confederation. This resolution turns into the Declaration of Independence, which is written by Thomas Jefferson, agreed upon by Congress on July 2, 1776, and then debated for 2 days before finally being signed on July 4, 1776. Before we go into the inaccuracies, I want to talk about how well Liberty's Kids portrayed what it was like to live in those times. In episode 2, a man gets tarred and feathered, and one character, James, learns the horrors of what happened after that is done to someone. In another episode, the kids and Moses stumble upon a slave auction taking place in Virginia. The 3 kids are horrified, and Moses feels uncomfortable and angry. Then there's what it's like to be in the Continental Army. In quite a few episodes, when we see the army in the show, their clothes are torn and dirty, their shoes are being held together by strips of cloth, and they're all just waiting for the time when their enlistment expires so they can go home. This is what it was like for people back then, and the show portrays each of these very well, so that kids pick up on what it was like, but it's not too scary for them. Yes, at the time, people were tarred and feathered like we see in the show. African Americans were sold as if they were things instead of people, and the Continental Army barely had enough food or supplies during parts of the Revolutionary War, and the show portrays each of these so well. That's part of what makes Liberty's Kids such a good show. While most of the show is historically accurate, there are some inaccuracies. One thing that is mentioned is in episode 3, when it is mentioned that England gave Canada the Ohio River Valley, when that is not the case. In fact, at the time, England owned Canada, so giving the Ohio River Valley to Canada makes no sense for the time period. The last inaccuracies are when the show portrays the Continental Army as being upset or grouchy after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and homing pigeons being used throughout episode 10. None of these are true. First of all, historically, the colonists celebrated Bunker Hill as a victory, despite the casualties that came from it and the fact that the British won. So, when the show portrays the Continental Army as feeling upset after the battle, that's just incorrect. The Continental Army celebrated the Battle of Bunker Hill not because they won, but because the battle weakened the British Army because of the number of casualties that came from it. Then there's the use of homing pigeons. When I was watching the show and saw that homing pigeons were being used, I was confused, because I didn't think that homing pigeons were used in the Revolutionary War, and I was right. When I dug deeper, I saw that homing pigeons were not used until the 19th century, decades after the events of Liberty's Kids. Liberty's Kids was able to be historically accurate that didn't end up being too intense or too boring for younger audiences. Part of what makes Liberty's Kids so good is that it shows both sides of history, the exciting victories, but also the somewhat sad truth of what was happening at the time. All in all, if you're looking for a way to learn about the American Revolution in a fun yet educational way, Liberty's Kids is the way to go.